The last people who tested Dario Ferrante did it on a Tuesday, and by Friday 2 of them owned nothing and the third had left the country under a name that was not his. That was the version of the story people told, and the details drifted, and it did not matter that they drifted, because the point of the story never changed. You did not test the man. A restaurant near the harbor kept a corner table empty for him every night of the year, and he never once sat there, and the owner kept it empty anyway, because an empty table cost less than being wrong about Dario Ferrante. That was how the whole city arranged itself around him. It folded into careful shapes so it would never have to find out what he would actually do. So it meant something that on the last warm night of that autumn, the most dangerous man on the coast was lying flat on his back in the grass of his own garden, under the old oak, with his eyes shut and his hands folded loose on his chest, and a thin knife lying cool against his ribs inside his coat. He was not asleep. He had not slept a whole night in 3 years. 2 nights before, Nico had come into the study with his face closed like a fist and set a photograph on the desk. The service rode at the back of the property, the motion light throwing its hard cone across the gravel, and in the corner of the frame, half caught in the light and turning out of it, a shape that did not belong to the night crew. Somebody had been walking the grounds after the house went dark. Nico had run the tapes back 3 weeks and found the same shape moving through the same blind spots on the same nights, learning the estate the way a thief learns a lock, and Nico's read was short and it was ugly. There was a killer inside the walls, and they were close now, and they were nearly ready. Dario had listened. He had thanked him. He had told him to do nothing. He wanted to see it himself. So he had come out to the oak at the hour when the whole house believed him bolted behind his door, and he had made himself into bait. He had slowed his breath until it went even. He had let his mouth soften and his hands fall open, and he had lain down in the dark that his wife used to be afraid of, under the tree she had loved more than any room in the house, and he had waited to learn who under his own roof had the nerve to come for his life. He would give them the target. He would let them get close, and then he would find out everything they knew, in the quiet with his hands. He heard the footsteps, and every muscle in him went still in the particular way that violent men learn to go still. They were wrong. That was the first thing his body knew before his mind caught up. They were too light and too quick, and there were too many of them for 2 feet, a small, uneven patter coming straight across the grass with no care at all for the blind spots or the guards, and no one who had ever killed a man walked toward a body like that. Something touched his cheek. It was a hand, and it was very small, and it patted his face twice and then a 3rd time, the flat little slaps of someone who has decided you are a door. Dario opened one eye. A child stood over him in the dark. She could not have been more than 2, round in the cheeks and unsteady on her feet, in a nightdress gone gray from washing and a pair of socks that did not match. She had a fist closed around something. She leaned down until her nose nearly touched his and studied him with the total unblinking seriousness that only the very young and the very old ever manage, and then she opened her fist between them, and inside was half a butter cracker, soft at the broken edge where she had already been gnawing on it, and she pushed it toward his mouth. The man who owned the harbor did not move. He lay in his own grass with a knife against his ribs while a 2-year-old fed him a soggy cracker, and for the length of 3 heartbeats, he had no idea in the world what to do with his hands. He had spent 30 years teaching a city to be afraid of him. It took a child who could not yet say his name less than a minute to leave him with nothing at all. "No," he said, and his voice came out low and rough, the voice that emptied rooms and it did nothing. The girl kept the cracker at his lips. When he still would not take it, she made a small impatient sound and pressed it harder, and a wet crumb caught on his lower lip, and she looked so pleased with what she had done that something behind his sternum, something that had been packed in ice for 3 years, cracked straight down the center. Then a woman came out of the dark at a dead run. She came so fast and so silent that he had the knife half out of his coat before his mind had decided to draw it, and even in that half-second some old part of him took the measure of how she moved. Low, balanced, not a wasted motion anywhere in her, a body that knew, in its bones, how to close distance on a target. She was on them before he was fully upright. She scooped the child off his chest in one clean pull, turned her shoulder to cover the girl, and put her own body squarely between the knife and the toddler, and only then, with the child pressed to her, did she stop moving, and go still, and wait. She was the new maid. He knew her the way he knew all of them, which was to say hardly at all. Mara. A few months in the house, the back rooms and the linens and the early shift, head down, silent and less spoken to. He had walked past her 100 times and could not have named the color of her eyes. He could now. In the light spilling out of the kitchen windows, they were dark and level, fixed on the blade in his hand, and there was no shaking in her. None of the animal thing he had seen in grown men when steel came out. She held her child, and she looked at the knife, and she waited to see what he would do, and her breathing stayed slow. That was wrong, too. He filed it beside the footsteps. She got out of her bed, the woman said. I'm sorry, it won't happen again. The child had both arms locked around her mother's neck, and was watching him over the woman's shoulder with the cracker still fisted in one hand, and she smiled at him. A wide, gummy, delighted smile, aimed at the most feared man on the coast, as though the two of them shared something no one else in the garden knew. He put the knife away. What's her name? He said. The woman's arms tightened by a fraction. It was the only part of her that moved. Nina. He got to his feet. He was a big man, and he came up slow, and he watched her track the change in his height without giving ground, holding her place with a baby on her hip in front of a man the whole city ran from, and he set that beside the balance and the slow breath and the silent feet. Take her inside, he said. It's cold. She went. She did not put her back to him until she reached the door. He noticed that, too. He stood alone under the oak for a long time after the kitchen light went out. He had come here to find a killer. He had found a baby with a cracker and a servant who moved like the most dangerous thing he had spent his whole life learning to recognize. And as he walked back across the wet grass toward the house, he understood two things with the cold clarity that had kept him breathing for 30 years. The shape Nico had photographed on the grounds was real, and someone in this house wanted him dead. And he had just met her, and she had a 2-year-old, and she had put her body between her child and his knife without a flicker while she counted the exits with her eyes. He did not tell Nico. He told himself it was because he wanted to be certain, and that was half a lie, and some quiet part of him knew which half. The truth underneath it was that when the little girl had pushed that cracker to his mouth, a thing had happened in him that had not happened since they lowered Camilla into the ground, and he was not ready to hand the source of it to Nico's men and their quiet, efficient hands. He went up to the study and poured a drink he did not drink and stood at the tall windows over the dark grounds, and he thought about the woman putting herself in front of the blade, and he thought, whatever you are not a maid. He had no idea he was already standing exactly where she wanted him. To understand the man at the window, you have to understand what the house had been, and what had been taken out of it. Dario Ferrante had inherited the family at 26 and buried the men who believed a young boss could be steered. He held the docks through a nest of paper companies, and one more that existed only as a name, breathed in the back offices of the port. He held a casino that took in more untaxed cash on a Saturday than most banks saw in a month, and he held the judge who signed its license, and he held the silence of the 2 detectives who had once thought hard about the judge. Men who crossed him did not always die. Sometimes they only became poor and frightened in ways that could not be traced to any single hand, and the older capos said that was the worse fate, because a bullet was an ending, and Dario preferred to leave a man alive inside the ruins of everything he used to be. And once, for a few years, in the middle of all of that, he had been something else as well. He had been a man who came home. There had been a woman named Camilla who filled the long rooms with a voice and a temper and a laugh you could hear from the drive, who had planted the beds along the south wall with her own hands and had loved the old oak past all reason and had made him, against every rule he had built his life on, soft in exactly one place. And then men had put 4 charges on the underside of the river bridge on a Thursday evening, and the intelligence had come to him that it was Il Corvo's order, the rival old country boss whose people he had been circling for a year, and by the time Dario reached the water it was full of glass and steel and 14 strangers and his wife, and the softness went out of him the way heat goes out of a body, and it did not come back. He had gone to war. He had done terrible things. He had burned the Corvo house to the ground with the men who wore the crow inside it, and he had told himself the whole time that the fire was justice, even while some cold, sober part of him, standing well back from the grief, had watched the flames and thought, this does not fit. This was never his kind of war, and had done it anyway, because the grief had needed somewhere to go and revenge was the only door open. 3 years of not sleeping had followed. 3 years of walking his own grounds in the dark because the bed was worse. 3 years of a chair at the head of the dining table that no one was allowed to move and no one was allowed to sit in, so that he ate upstairs, alone, off a tray, rather than look at it. That was the man a child had fed a cracker to in the grass. Nico found him at the window near dawn. Nico had been with the family since before Dario was boss. He had carried the old man's coffin, and he had knelt in the rain at Camilla's grave one step behind Dario and had watched something go out of the man he served, and he was loyal in the way of a dog that has decided on one person for life. Loyalty, though, is not the same as agreement, and Nico had a nose for a mistake, and standing in the study doorway he could smell one coming off his boss like smoke. You were out under the tree, Nico said. It was not a question. He had men on the wall. He knew where Dario went. I couldn't sleep. You had the knife. Dario said nothing. Nico came a step into the room. Whoever it is on those tapes, they're not casing us for fun. Give me a week. I'll turn over every soul in this house and I'll find the one that doesn't sit right, and then it's finished and you can sleep. He waited. Boss, let me do my job. Not yet, Dario said. Nico looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind the old man's eyes that Dario chose not to read, and then Nico nodded once and left, because that was the shape of them. But Nico did not stop thinking about it, and in the back of his careful mind, quietly, without ever quite saying the words to himself, he began to make a plan for the day his boss's mistake came due. That decision would matter later. It would matter more than anyone in the house could have guessed. Down in the servants' wing, in a narrow room off the back corridor, the killer sat on the edge of a hard bed with a sleeping child against her chest and let her hands, at last, be allowed to shake. She had been so close. Not tonight. Tonight had been a catastrophe, Nina slipping the latch while Mara thought her down, Mara waking to a cold cot and a pit opening in her stomach, running the halls in her bare feet with her pulse slamming until she came around the hedge and saw her baby standing over the body of Dario Ferrante with a cracker in her fist. For one white instant, Mara had thought he was dead. For one instant, she had thought someone had done the thing for her, and what had gone through her at that thought had been nothing like relief, and it was exactly that, exactly the shape of what she had felt, that she could not afford. She had been in the house 11 weeks. She had the patrol schedule and the blind spots, and the 1 hour before dawn when the estate had the fewest men awake. She had watched how he took his coffee, and how the gate crew changed, and how the house breathed, and taped under the frame of the very bed she sat on was a knife. A good one. And she had come within a whisper of using all of it, and instead here she was, shaking, with her dead husband's ring on a chain against her breastbone and her sister's child asleep in her arms. Not her child. That was the lie she wore easiest of all, because a maid's baby is invisible, and invisible was the whole point. Only Mara knew that the girl was her sister's, that Lucia had died with a hole in her and her husband beside her on a night the whole family had been meant to die. That Mara had carried the baby out of a burning nursery in her own arms with the ceiling coming down, and had raised her in the 3 years since as her own, because there was no one left in the entire world to do it. 3 years since Dario Ferrante's people came for her family and left almost nothing standing. That was what she had been told. That was what Corrado had told her, over and over in the long gray rooms where he had made her, where he had taken a 19-year-old drowning in grief and given her steady hands and a slow heartbeat and something to do with all of it. The Ferrante did this. The Ferrante murdered your father. The Ferrante killed Lucia, killed her husband, burned the house down over them, and would have burned the baby too if you had not carried her out. And when you are patient enough, and quiet enough, and good enough, you will walk into his house, and you will take from him everything he took from us. She had believed it because it was the only shape her grief would fit inside. A person cannot carry that much loss aimed at nothing. Corrado had given her a target and a purpose and a knife, and she had thanked him for it the way you thank the man who throws you a rope while you are going under. And only much later, in this house, in the dark, had she started to notice how much the rope resembled a leash. Nina made a small sound and turned her face into her mother's neck. "I know," Myra whispered to no one, to the child, to herself. "I know, soon." She lay awake until the window went gray. She did not know yet that the man 3 floors above had felt the same fracture through the same ice on the same night from the same small hand. She only knew that she had let him live and that she needed to understand why before it got her and the baby killed. The house woke early. By 6, the kitchen was thick with steam and low voices, and Mara was where a maid belonged, sleeves shoved up, moving through the work with her head down, the shaking put away where no one would ever find it. That was the one thing her father had left her that Corrado had never managed to twist. You keep the fear in a box, and you keep the box shut, and you do the next thing with your hands. She did not expect to see the boss before noon. The boss did not come to the kitchen. He came to the kitchen. He filled the doorway in a dark shirt with the collar open, and every voice in the room died at once, and every servant found something to do that required looking at the floor. Mara felt it before she looked up, the way a room changes when a large predator walks into it, that thing older than language that says be still. She looked up anyway. It was, she would decide much later, the first mistake and the last freedom, that she was a woman who looked up. His eyes came straight to her. "You," he said, "the coffee to the study." That was the housekeeper's task, not the new girl's. Mara felt the ripple go around the kitchen, the small stiffening of the older staff, and she watched the housekeeper's mouth open and shut because no one corrected Dario Ferrante about who would carry his coffee. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, sir." She carried the tray up the wide stairs with her pulse level and her mind moving fast. This was access. This was the thing she had spent 11 weeks trying to buy with invisibility, handed to her now for reasons she could not read, and the part of her that Corrado had built was already mapping the study. The single door, the tall windows, the letter opener on the blotter, the exact distance from the tray to the man. The other part of her, the part she was trying to starve, was remembering the way he had looked in the grass with a child's cracker at his mouth. And the wrecked human thing that had crossed his face for half a second before he had set the stone back down over it. He was at the window when she came in. He did not turn. "Set it down," he said. She set it down. She should have left. A maid sets down the tray and leaves. "Your daughter feeds strangers in the dark," he said. He turned, and his eyes found hers across the room and held them, and there was nothing sleepy anywhere in them. Where does a child learn that? "She's a baby. Bobbies don't know strangers." "Everyone knows strangers." He came away from the glass. He moved without hurry, which was somehow worse than hurry. "It's the first thing we learn, what is safe and what is not. Somebody unlearned it in her." He stopped on the far side of the desk, close enough now that she could see the 2 nights of no sleep sitting under his eyes. Or somebody taught her that nothing is dangerous because that person had already decided to keep every dangerous thing away from her herself. She said nothing. Her hands stayed folded in front of her apron. "You didn't scream," he said. "Last night, you came around that hedge and found your child standing over a man on the ground, and any mother in this house would have screamed. You made no sound. You put yourself between her and the knife before you knew the knife was real. A mother's fear is loud. Yours is quiet." He tilted his head a fraction. "Quiet is trained." The room had gone small. She understood, with a cold that went all the way to the floor, that this man had seen exactly the thing she was afraid he had seen, and that he had brought her up here alone to let her know he had seen it, and that she was one wrong breath from the end of everything. So she gave him a true thing to hide a truer one. "I grew up hard," she said. Her voice did not change. "You learn to be quiet when loud gets you hurt. You learn to put yourself in front of the small ones because if you don't, no one does. That isn't training, sir. That's being poor and being a woman and staying alive." She let her eyes fall at last, the picture of a servant recalling her place. "If Nina bothered you, I'm sorry. I'll keep her closer." For a long moment, he did not answer. "She didn't bother me," he said, and the way he said it made her look up again, and for one breath the stone was off his face, and what was under it was not what she had come armed against. She had come armed against a monster. She had not come armed against a man who was that tired of being one. "That's all," he said, and put the stone back. She left. In the corridor, she leaned against the wall for exactly 1 second. And then she straightened and went back down to the linens, because a box that stays shut is the only kind that keeps you alive. He did not send her away, and he could not have said why, and both of those things frightened him in a way he had not been frightened in years. He knew what she was. He knew it the way he knew weather coming in his teeth, in the old scars. Somewhere in his house, there was a knife with his name on it, and the odds were very good it belonged to the woman who had just carried up his coffee, and the only sane thing, the thing 30 years of survival was screaming at him to do, was to let Nico take her quietly and be done. And he was not going to do it. He told himself he needed to know who had sent her, and that was real, because a killer inside the walls meant an enemy he had not identified, and you do not close a door before you know what stands behind it. But under that, in the place he did not look, was a small hand patting his cheek and a woman shielding a child from a blade without a thought for herself, and the plain, unbearable fact that both of those things had reached into a chest he had welded shut over a grave and found something still alive in there against all odds. He would call it strategy for weeks. It was not strategy. It was the oldest and stupidest reason men have ever done reckless things, and he had believed himself long past it, and he was wrong. Over the days that followed, he built his reasons, and he built them carefully, because a man like Dario does not need to explain himself, which is exactly why the explanations he made were so good that even he could not see through them. He needed the study cleaned in the mornings, and the housekeeper had too much to do, so the new girl would do it. He kept odd hours and would not sit alone in the long dining room under his wife's empty chair, so the new girl would bring his meals up. He liked the grounds walked before he slept, and he did not like walking them with Nico breathing at his shoulder. So more than once he found himself out under the oak at the exact hour. The maid happened to be settling a restless child by the low garden wall. And neither of them said much, and both of them noticed everything, and the careful distance between a servant and a boss held, and did not fool either of them for a second. And there was the child. Nina had decided, on that first night, that Dario Ferrante belonged to her, and no fact in the world could argue her out of it. She was far too young to understand a single true thing about him. She only knew that the big, quiet man had let her feed him a cracker, and in the pure arithmetic of a 2-year-old that made him hers. She took to appearing at the study door while her mother worked. A stuffed rabbit worn down to gray felt hanging from one fist, and she would stand at the threshold and look at him until he looked back, and then she would hold up the rabbit as though it were evidence in a case only she understood. The first time it happened, he stared at her the way he would stare at a man reaching into a coat. The second time he heard himself say, "Is that yours?" And the child, reading the tone if not the words, walked straight into the room of the most feared man on the coast and dropped the rabbit in his lap and returned to the doorway to watch him hold it. Mara had frozen with a cloth in her hand. "Take it back," she said to the child, low, and started forward. Dario lifted one hand off the desk. It was not a command. It was closer to a request, and there was something in it she had not heard from him. "Leave it." She stopped. He held the rabbit in one scarred hand and looked at it the way you look at a foreign object, and the child watched him hold her most precious thing with the whole trust of a person who has never once been betrayed. And Mara stood in the middle of the study with her heart, doing exactly the thing she had ordered it not to do. This was the man. This was the monster she had crossed a country to kill, sitting behind a desk that had signed away lives, holding a felt rabbit as though it might come apart in his hands, while a baby who was not even her own beamed at him from the door, and Mara felt the whole careful structure of her hatred groan and shift under the weight of it. "She likes you," she said before she could stop the words. "Children have terrible judgment." He set the rabbit down with a care that was almost comic in a man his size and slid it back across the desk toward the door, and the child ran to reclaim it and clutched it and looked up at him with a joy so uncomplicated that he had to look away. "Sometimes," Mara said, "sometimes they see the thing the rest of us have decided not to." His head came up, sharp, and she knew she had said too much, that a maid did not speak to Dario Ferrante in riddles about what he might be under the stone, and she dropped her eyes and went back to the shelf. But the silence after it was not the silence of a boss and a servant. It was the silence of two people who have each seen a thing in the other they were not meant to see, and who have both decided, in the same breath apart, not to name it. The nights were the worst of it, for her, because at night the mission and the feeling had nowhere to hide from each other. She would settle Nina, and then she would lie in the dark with her father's plan running in one part of her head, and the sound of a scarred man saying leave it running in the other, and she would tell herself the softness was a weakness Corrado had trained out of her and would train out of her again, and she would not quite believe it. She began to hate the hour before dawn, the one she had chosen for the thing itself, because it was the hour her hands were most ready and her heart was least. The trouble broke the following week, at the dinner. Twice a year Dario opened the estate to the men who mattered, the capos and the money, and one or two of the outside families whose peace was worth the trouble of keeping, and the house filled with expensive suits and heavy perfume, and the particular hush of dangerous men being courteous to each other. The staff worked doubled and silent. Mara had not wanted anywhere near it. A room that full of that kind of attention was a room where a maid could be seen, and being seen was the enemy of everything she had built. But the housekeeper put her on the floor, and so she moved among the tables with wine and plates and her eyes down, and she was very good at not existing, and it very nearly held. It was one of the outside men who broke it. A heavy man with a wet smile and too many rings, a cousin to one of the families, the kind who is dangerous only because he stands near dangerous men and has learned to borrow their cruelty for the evening. He had been drinking since he arrived. When Mara leaned in to fill his glass, he put his hand on her low and let it stay, and said something into the noise of the table that made the men around him laugh, and pulled her toward him by the hip. The maid, the woman she had trained herself to be, would have gone still and let it pass. That was the whole discipline. You do not make a scene. You survive the hand and you move to the next glass and you disappear. She did not go still. It happened fast and it happened quiet, the way everything about her was quiet. Her free hand came down over his. The pouring hand set the bottle on the cloth without spilling a drop, and something in the way she turned his wrist wiped the wet smile off his face and put a small strangled sound in its place. She did not raise her voice. She leaned in close, close as a lover, and whatever she breathed into his ear was for him alone, and the man went the color of paper, and his ringed hand came off her as if she were a hot stove. The table nearest them had gone silent, then the next. Mara straightened, retrieved her bottle, and moved on to the following guest as though nothing had happened, and poured the next glass with a level hand, and folded herself back into the roll. But the silence spread, and up at the head of the long table Dario Ferrante set down his glass and watched a maid empty a room of the most dangerous men on the coast without spilling a drop, and something moved behind his eyes that no one at that table had ever seen in them before. It was not surprise. It was closer to hunger, and it had been 3 years since anything at all had lit it. Nico had seen it. Nico leaned in close to his boss's ear. "That was not a maid's hand," he said low. "I told you, give me the night and it ends." "No," Dario said. He did not look away from the doorway she had gone through. "Boss." I said no, and there was a thing in his voice that shut it. Nico sat back. He watched the doorway too. He did not have Dario's reasons, and his own were simpler, and they did not include letting an unknown killer stay a single night longer under a roof he was paid with his life to keep. Something in Nico hardened at that table, and it would matter later, more than anyone in the room could have known. There was a moment, near the end, that Mara would carry for the rest of her life. She had gone out to the terrace with a tray of empty glasses, into the cold and the quiet, and Dario had come out after her. He did not touch her. He stood a careful arm's length away at the stone rail and looked out over his dark grounds, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the noise of the party came muffled through the glass behind them. "The man with the rings will not be coming back to this city," Dario said at last. She kept stacking the glasses. "That's your business, sir." "He put his hand on someone under my roof." He turned his head, and in the light from the windows his face was all edges, and there was the danger in it that emptied rooms, and under the danger, aimed at her, something that was not danger at all, and the two things together were harder to stand in front of than either would have been alone. I don't allow that. I handled it. I saw a pause. That's the trouble. She made herself meet his eyes. It was the hardest thing she had done in 11 weeks, harder than the knife under the bed, harder than the schedules. You should be careful what you keep in your house, sir, she said. You don't know what half of it is. No, he agreed, and did not look away, and there was the hunger again, banked low. But I'm beginning to want to. She took the tray inside before her hands could betray her. Behind her, on the cold terrace, the most dangerous man on the coast stood alone at the rail for a long time, and did not go in, and understood that he had crossed some line in himself that he had sworn after Camilla he would never approach again, and could not, for the life of him, make himself step back from it. The heavy man with the rings was gone within the hour and was not seen in the city again, and the story that a servant girl had frightened him white ran through the staff like fire and reached Mara by the time she was scrubbing the last pans at midnight, and she cursed herself for every second of it. She had been careless. She had let the box come open. 11 weeks of being no one, undone in 10 seconds because a fool put a hand on her, and something older and colder than her patience had answered before she could stop it. Now the whole house knew the new girl was not what she seemed. Now the boss knew it past any doubt, and worse than knowing it, he was drawn to it, and a man drawn to you watches you, and a woman who cannot be watched cannot do what she had come to do. She had, with her own hands, ruined the invisibility she needed to finish this. And still, when she thought of him saying no to Nico, of the weight of his eyes on her back as she left the dining room, of the thing under the danger on the cold terrace, the box would not shut all the way, and it terrified her more than any guard on any wall. She needed instructions. She needed the leash, if she was honest, needed the one voice that had always told her what she was and where to point it, because her own compass had started spinning, and she did not trust it. So the next night, in the dead hour, she went over the south wall the way she had taught herself to go over it, silent through the one blind spot she had spent weeks mapping, and she went to see her uncle. He had come to the city 3 weeks before, for the family, he had said, so they could go home together after it was done. He kept a shuttered place near the old market, a restaurant that had failed years ago, and that he owned through some paper the way men like him own things. And he was there when she came in through the back, sitting alone at a single table under a single hanging bulb in a room full of chairs stacked on tables, an old man in a good gray coat with his hands folded, and a small, sad smile ready on his face. Oralia, Corrado Speranza said. He said the dead name softly, the way you say the name of a thing you own. You look thin. That house doesn't feed its people. She sat, she did not embrace him. She had not in some time, and neither of them remarked on it. It's slow, she said. He's careful. He changed the gate crew. I need more time. You've had 11 weeks. The smile stayed, mild and patient, and his eyes above it did not smile at all, and she had known him her whole adult life and had somehow never once let herself look straight at that gap between his mouth and his eyes. You had him under a tree, child. You told me yourself. On his back in the grass in the dark, a knife in your reach, and you came away. He unfolded his hands and laid them flat on the table. Tell me why. There was a child, she said. His people were close. It was wrong. I don't waste the one shot on a bad night. There's always a reason. He said it gently, and it landed like a slap. For 3 years I've watched you find reasons. You were too young, then you weren't ready, then he was too guarded. Now there's a child. He leaned back, and the chair creaked in the empty room. Whose child, Oralia? The bulb hummed. Somewhere out in the market, a dog was barking at nothing. Lucia's, she said. Your sister's, he agreed. The one I pulled from the fire and put in your arms, so that you would have something to protect, so that a woman with something to lose would walk into any house and hold any knife and mean it all the way down. That was the purpose of the child. He said it the way another man might discuss a tool left out in the rain. Not to soften you, to sharpen you, and instead you have let it turn you into exactly the thing I built you to destroy. A woman who cares more about a warm house than her own blood. Don't, she said low. Your father trusted for 40 years, and look where trust put him. Something crossed his face, quick, and was gone under the mildness, and she would only understand what it was much later. "You have until the end of the month. That is not my patience running out, girl. That is the calendar. There are things in motion that do not wait on your heart. When he is dead, you signal me, and I will be close. And we will go home." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his was dry and cool, and she made herself not pull away. "I am the only family you have left in the world, Aurelia. I made you. Don't make me remember that a thing that will not do what it was made for is only a thing." She went back over the wall before dawn with her heart cold and her hands colder, and she told herself it was resolve. She lay in the dark beside the sleeping child and stared at the ceiling, and the thing that would not settle in her was not the deadline. It was the gap between his mouth and his eyes. She had leaned into a man's ear the night before and frightened him white, and there had been more warmth in that than in her uncle's smile. And for the first time in 3 years, lying there, a single question surfaced in her that Corrado had spent 3 years making sure she would never think to ask. Why had he never once let her grieve out loud? She did not have the answer yet, but the question was in the house now, and questions like that do not leave. Nico found her the next afternoon. He caught her in the back stair with a load of linens, and he stood 1 step above her so she had to look up. And he was not a large man, but there was a gun somewhere under his coat, and 30 years of doing terrible things quietly in his eyes. "I've been in this family a long time," he said. "I've seen everything that comes through these doors. Grifters, federal plants, girls sent by the other families to open their legs and their ears at the same time. I know what a plant looks like, and I know what a killer looks like, and I have watched you for 3 weeks, and you are the second one." He came down a step. "He won't hear it. He's not himself, hasn't been since the wife, but I don't answer to whatever's wrong with him. I answer to keeping him alive. So hear me, girl. Whatever you're waiting for, whatever night you've picked, I will be awake for it. And if you so much as breathe wrong near him, I will put you in the harbor myself, and I will do it kindly, because of the child, but I will do it." Mara held the linens and held his eyes and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not confirm him, and after a moment he stepped aside and let her pass, and she went up the stair with her spine straight and her mind already knowing, coldly, that Nico was right and that Nico was a problem, and that the window she had left was closing from 2 directions at once. She would finish it that night. She had decided on the stair. Before the house tightened any further, before the deadline, before whatever was growing in her got her sister's child killed, she would go up in the dead hour and do the thing she had crossed a country to do, and then she would take Nina and go, and grieve the thing she had nearly let herself feel later in some other country, in some other life. She never found out whether she could have done it. Because someone else came for Dario Ferrante that same night, and they were not conflicted, and they were not slow. She had the knife off the bed frame, and Nina checked and deep under, 1 small fist curled around the gray rabbit, and she had kissed the child's warm head and promised her, in a whisper, that this was the last terrible thing, and she was 3 steps from the study door with her heart level and her hands ready when she heard the wrong sound. Glass giving way somewhere it should not. A soft, heavy footfall out on the terrace beyond the study windows. And every instinct her father had put in her, and Corrado had sharpened, stood up at once. She did not think. She was through the study door in a breath, into the dark, and Dario was at the desk, awake, always awake, half rising with his hand already going for the drawer where the gun was. And behind him, one of the tall windows was open to the night, and a shape was coming through it fast with a length of wire stretched tight between 2 fists. There was no time for the gun. There was no time for anything except the thing she was. She crossed the room. Afterward, she could never say she had decided. There was no room in it for deciding. There was only the shape and the wire and the man at the desk, and her body moving the way it had been built to move, low and fast, and without one wasted motion, and she took the intruder off Dario an instant before the wire found his throat. What happened then happened in the dark, and it happened quickly, and it was not clean and it was not graceful. It was 2 trained people trying to end each other in a space too small for it, and Dario Ferrante, who had killed men with his hands and watched it done 100 times, stood frozen at his own desk and watched a Maid fight for his life like something out of the worst and best story he had ever been told. She was better than the man in the window. It was close, and it cost her. She took the wire across one forearm and a knee that put her down for a heartbeat. But she was better. And it ended the way those things end, sudden and ugly and final. And then the room was still, and there was a body on the study floor, and a woman kneeling over it with blood on her arm and her chest heaving. And she looked up at the man she had come to kill, whose life she had just saved without meaning to, and neither of them made a sound. The house was waking now, feet on the stairs, Nico's voice. Dario moved before the door opened. He came around the desk and took her by her good arm and pulled her up and put his own body between her and the doorway, exactly the way she had put herself between a baby and a blade under the oak. And when Nico came through the door with two men and guns up, what they saw was the boss on his feet, unharmed, standing over a dead intruder, with the maid behind him. "Terrace," Dario said, and his voice was iron and the men moved. "Two on the wall. I want to know how he got past the gate." He did not let go of her arm. Nico's eyes went to that, to the boss's hand on the woman, to the blood, to the whole impossible shape of it, and Nico was not a stupid man, and Dario watched him understand at least half of it in one look. "Boss," Nico started. "She stays with me," Dario said. "See to the wall." It took an hour to clear the room. There was a body to move and a story to build and a household to calm, and through all of it Dario kept the woman at his side, behind his door, and did not once let any hand come near her. And by the time the estate finally went quiet, the sky was going gray for the second time since she had come into the house, and they were alone. He turned to her. She had bound her own arm with a strip torn from her sleeve, tight and practiced, and she stood in the center of his study with her back straight and her chin up and waited, because there was no more hiding. He had watched her do it. There was no version of this dawn where she went back to being no one. "Who sent you?" he said. She did not answer. "You came here to kill me. I've known since the first night. I let you stay because I wanted to see who was pulling the wire." He took a step toward her. "And tonight somebody else pulled a real one, and instead of standing back and letting me die and going home to whoever pays you, you crossed the room. So I'll ask you again, and this time you'll answer. Who sent you? And why did you save the man you came to kill?" And Mara, trained by the best and broken by the worst, who had kept the box shut for 3 years through everything the world had thrown against the lid, felt it come open all the way, and she did the thing she had sworn she would never do. She reached up and drew the chain out from under her collar, and on it hung 2 things: a man's wedding ring, worn thin, and a small pendant, blackened silver, in the shape of a bird with its wings swept back. Dario Ferrante went very still. "You know it," she said. It was not a question. She had seen his face change. "That's a crow." His voice had gone quiet and strange. "That's the Corvo mark. I put every man who wore it in the ground 3 years ago." He looked at her, and she watched him do the arithmetic, watched him find the shape of it, and something moved through him that she had not braced for, something that looked almost like grief. "There were no children," I made certain. "The Corvo line ended on the bridge and in the fire after it." "It didn't." Her hand closed around the pendant. "A daughter carried a baby out of a burning nursery. They called me Oralia, before I decided a dead girl needed a plainer name." Her voice did not break, but it thinned, stretched over something too big for the room. "You burned our house, my father, my sister, her husband. You burned it over them, and you would have burned the baby too. And I have spent 3 years learning to be quiet enough and patient enough and good enough to walk into your house and take from you what you took from all of us. That's who sent me, Dario Ferrante. Your war sent me, I sent myself." For a long moment he did not speak. The gray came up in the windows and found the lines in his face. "I burned the Corvo house," he said at last, slow, even. He was not a man who lied to save his own skin, and he did not lie now. "For the men who wore that bird, because someone put 4 charges under a bridge and blew my wife into the river with 14 strangers, and the word came to me that it was your father's order, so I went to war, and I did terrible things, and I have not slept a full night since." He held her eyes. "But a house with your sister in it, a baby in a nursery. That was not my order. My order was for the men. You expect me to believe that?" "I expect nothing." Something raw came up under the even voice. "I've done enough to be hated for the rest of my life without borrowing anyone's sins. But that night has never once fit in my hands, and I'll show you why." He crossed the room to the wall behind the desk, and he moved a painting she had dusted a dozen times, and behind it there was a small steel door in the plaster, and he worked the lock with his back to her, and she stood with the pendant in her fist and did not understand what she was watching. He took out a flat metal case and set it on the desk between them and opened it, and inside was 3 years of a man who could not let a thing go. A cassette tape, a thin folder of papers, and in a paper sleeve, a photograph. "When the word came about the bridge," he said, "it came through a go-between, a man who carried messages between my family and yours in the old days when there was still a peace to keep." He set 2 fingers on the folder. "This is what he brought me. The intelligence that told me your father put the bombs on the river. I burned a house on the strength of what's in here. And I kept it all 3 years because it never sat right, and I could never say why, and I am not a man who keeps souvenirs." He turned the folder toward her. "Read the hand." She looked down. The papers were covered in a small, careful, backward-leaning script, a note in the margins, an instruction, a date, and Mara stopped breathing because she knew that hand. She had watched that hand write out her lessons for 3 years. She had 100 pages of it locked in her own memory, the slant of the letters, the way the man crossed a 7. "That's not," she said and stopped. Her mouth had gone dry. "That's—" He pressed the cassette into an old machine on the shelf, and after a hiss of tape, a voice came out of it, thin and gray and mild. A voice telling a story about a bridge and an order and Il Corvo. A voice she had heard tell her 1,000 other stories in 1,000 gray rooms, and it went through her like cold water down the spine, and she put her hand on the edge of the desk to keep herself up. "You know the voice," Dario said, quiet, not a question. She could not speak. She reached past him with a hand that had gone unsteady for the first time in years, and she took the photograph out of its sleeve, because she already knew, and she had to see it, and she turned it to the gray window light. It was a surveillance photograph, grainy, dated in the corner in a technician's stamp. It showed the Corvo house from across the road. It showed it before the fire, the windows still whole, and it showed men at the gate, and standing among them, calm, unhurried, giving some instruction with one raised hand in a good gray coat, was her uncle, Corrado. The man who had told her, over and over, for 3 years, in that same mild voice on the tape, that he had arrived too late, that he had come and found the house already burning, that he had run into the flames and pulled her and the baby out and could save no one else. He was standing at the gate of her family's house, in daylight, before the first flame, giving orders to the men who would light it. The photograph shook in her hand. "No," she said, it came out cracked. "No, he pulled us out, he ran in, he—" She could not finish a sentence. 3 years of memory were coming apart all at once and reordering themselves into a shape she could not look at directly and could not look away from. The long gray rooms, the patience drilled into her. The way he had never once let her ask questions, only obey, only sharpen, only wait. The child put into her arms as a tool, the deadline that did not wait on her heart. The gap between his mouth and his eyes. "He's the go-between," she said to herself, to the room, to no one. "He carried word between the families. He told your father, he told you, he told." Her hand went to her own mouth. "He told me." "One man," Dario said. His own voice had gone rough now, and there was a thing in his eyes that had been buried under 3 years of stone and was clawing its way back into the light. "Standing between 2 families, feeding each of us the story that turned us on the other. And when we'd finished tearing each other to the ground, one man was left standing where 2 thrones used to be. He raised me to kill you." The words came out of her flat and terrible. "He killed my father, my sister, your wife, all of it. And then he took what was left of me and he pointed it at the one man who couldn't fight back, because the one man who couldn't fight back was the one man who'd never suspect the girl he'd wronged had been sent by the man who'd wronged them both." She looked up and the pendant was still in her fist, and her dead husband's ring hung beside it, and she had come across a country armed against a monster, and the monster was standing in a photograph at her family's gate, and it was not the man in front of her. 11 weeks, she said, and her voice finally broke all the way. "I've had a knife under my bed for 11 weeks. For you, and it was him, it was always him and I." "I know," Dario said. "You don't." She was shaking now, openly, the box not just open but shattered, and it was almost more than she could stand. The size of it, 3 years of grief aimed the whole time at the wrong heart. I looked at you holding that rabbit and I hated myself for what it did to me, because I thought I was betraying my father to feel it, and my father. A sound came out of her that she had never made. My father died because his own brother sold him a lie about you, and I nearly finished what the lie started. I nearly did his last job for him. But you didn't. Dario crossed to her, and he did not touch her. He stood close, the way she had stood close to a man's ear, and there was nothing of the monster in his face now, only the wreck of the same grief she was drowning in. You saved my life last night with every reason to end it. You've stood between a killer and me twice now, once for my throat and once from Nico. Whatever the lie did to you, it didn't finish. You're still in there. He didn't get all of you. She looked at him, at the man she had been made to destroy, whose wife the same hand had murdered, the only person left alive in the whole world who had lost exactly what she had lost to exactly the same man. And the thing that had been growing in her for 11 weeks against her every order stood fully up at last and could not be sat back down. Where is he now? Dario said. Your uncle, Corrado, he's in the city. He'll want the signal. Her mind was moving again now, cold and fast and horrified, and she wiped her face hard with the back of her wounded arm and made herself into the thing that could think. He's close. He said he wanted to be near, for the family, so we could go home together after you were dead. That's a lie, too. He wants to be near so that the moment you die he can move on whatever's left of your organization while it's leaderless and reeling. He used me to open the door, and he's been standing on the other side of it for 3 weeks waiting to walk through. Something crossed her face. He gave me until the end of the month. He said there are things in motion that don't wait. That means he's already moving. He's not waiting on me anymore. He never really was. I was only ever the door. Then we take the door off its hinges, Dario said, before he can use it. And 2 floors below, a small girl woke in a narrow bed with a gray rabbit in her fist and reached for a mother who was not there. There would be time, later, for the 2 of them to sit with the size of what they had learned. There was no time now. Because the thing about a man like Corrado, the thing that had made him so patient and so careful for so long, was that he did not leave loose ends, and a niece who had not sent the signal, who had let the target live, who had been seen leaning warm into another man's ear, was a loose end, and Corrado Speranza had not survived 30 years in the doorway between 2 families by waiting politely for loose ends to explain themselves. Nico came to the study at full daylight with a face like ash. The child, he said, the maid's child, gone from her room. Mara was across the study and out the door before he finished the sentence, down the servants' stair 3 at a time, and the narrow room was empty, the cot cold, the window open, the gray rabbit lying on the floor where it had fallen from a small hand that had not let go of it willingly in a year. On the pillow, where a child's head should have been, was a single blackened silver crow. The sound Mara made filled the little room, and then it stopped, cut off hard, because she was ill Corvo's daughter and grief was a thing that got you killed and she needed her hands. Dario was in the doorway behind her. He looked at the crow on the pillow, at the open window, at the woman gone white and still in the center of the room, and the last of the stone came off his face for good. He has her, Mara said. Her voice had gone flat and level and terrible. He took her to bring me. He knows you're alive. He knows I turned. He'll use her to make me come, and then he'll kill us both, and he'll do it somewhere he thinks he owns. She turned, and there was nothing soft anywhere in her, and Dario, who had frightened a city, felt the hair rise on his arms. There's a warehouse on the South Docks, the old cannery. He kept me there when he made me. It's the only place near here he thinks of as his. That's where he'll be. That's where he'll want me to come alone and out of my mind, because a woman out of her mind is easy to kill. She bent and picked the gray rabbit up off the floor and held it against her chest once hard, and then she looked at him. So I won't come alone, and I won't come out of my mind. I'll come in the shape he taught me to hide, and I'll take my daughter back, and I'll put him in the ground with my father's mark in his hand. Dario said. She looked at him. He killed my wife, Dario said. He killed your father. He put a wire on my throat and a knife in your hand and pointed us at each other, and this morning he took a 2-year-old out of her bed to use as bait. I have spent 3 years being the most dangerous man in this city with nothing to point it at. Point me at him. He held out his hand, not to command, the way he had reached for the rabbit, the way he had said leave it, and there was a thing in his face that neither of them had words for and both of them knew. "Whatever you decide about me after, about the fire, about your father, I'll stand there and take it. But first we get Nina." For a moment she did not move. Then she took his hand. It was not a gentle thing. It was two killers agreeing to go and do a terrible thing together, her hand hard and cold in his, her arm bound in her own torn sleeve, his jaw set. But her fingers closed around his and stayed, and something passed between them in that grip that no amount of stone could hide anymore. And Nico, watching from the doorway, saw it, and understood at last exactly what had been growing under his own careful nose for 11 weeks, and made, in that moment, a final quiet decision of his own. "I'm coming," Nico said. They both turned. "I've served this family since before you were boss," he said to Dario, and his voice was rough. "I knelt in the rain at her grave, and I've spent 3 years hatting the Corvo for it, and if it was one man feeding all of us the story." His hand went to the gun at his hip. "Then I've hated the wrong people for 3 years, and I'd like to go and correct that, boss." Dario looked at his oldest man for a long moment. Then he nodded, once. They moved fast after that. There was no time for an army, and an army was the wrong tool besides, because Corrado would be watching the roads and would kill the child the moment he saw a convoy. What they needed was quiet and speed, and the one thing Corrado had never once accounted for in 3 years of building his weapon, which was that his weapon might turn in his hand. Mara changed out of the maid's gray. She did not put on anything a killer wears in a film. She put on dark clothes that let her move and shoes that made no sound, and she took the good knife from under the bed frame, and she took a second one that Dario handed her without a word from a drawer in his study. And she took a gun and checked it with the sure, fast hands of someone who had checked 1,000. And Dario watched her become fully, at last, the thing she had been hiding, and he did not look away, and she felt him not look away. And it did something to her that they would both have to answer for if either of them lived to morning. In the car, on the road down to the docks, Nico driving, the gray city sliding past the glass, Mara sat beside Dario in the back with the rabbit in her lap and spoke without looking at him. "If we get her out," she said. "If we live, I don't know what I am to you. I came into your house to kill you. I still don't know if I believe every word about the fire, not all the way down, not yet. I might spend the rest of my life not able to look at your hands without seeing my father." "I know," Dario said. "But that little girl fed you a cracker in the dark because some part of her, some part that's cleaner than either of us, looked at you lying under that tree and decided you were safe." Her hand tightened on the rabbit. "And I've spent 11 weeks watching you hold this thing like it might come apart in your hands, and telling myself it didn't matter, and it mattered every single day." She turned her head at last and looked at him. "So I don't know what I am to you. But I know you're the only person left alive in the whole world who would burn down a city to get her back. And right now, that's the only thing I need to know about you." Dario looked at her. The city slid past. Nico kept his eyes on the road and pretended, out of a decency no one would ever have credited him with, not to hear. "When Camilla died," Dario said, and it was the first time he had said the name aloud to another living person in 3 years, "I decided I was finished, not with the work, with the other thing. I decided I would never again let anything into my chest that could be taken back out of it, because the taking nearly killed me, and a man in my position cannot afford to be nearly killed by grief." He looked down at his own scarred hands, the hands she could not stop seeing. "And then a baby put a cracker to my mouth, and I felt something for the first time in 3 years, and I was furious about it every day because it meant I wasn't finished after all. It meant I could still lose something." He looked up. "I have spent every one of these 11 weeks looking for a reason to send you both away and keep myself safe, and I could not find one, and this morning he took the child, and I finally understood why I couldn't. It was already too late for me. It's been too late since the first night. I let you both in without deciding to, the way you let people in when you're too tired to keep them out." His hand turned over on the seat between them, open. "So if that's what I am to you, then that's what I am. And I'll take the rest, the hatting and the not knowing, for as long as you need to give it to me. Just help me get her out." Mara did not say anything. She reached over in the dark of the back seat and put her hand over his open, scarred hand. the hand she could not stop seeing, and held it. And it was, in its way, the most romantic thing either of them had ever done. Two people with every reason left in the world to destroy each other, choosing instead, in a moving car, on the way to the worst morning of their lives, to hold on. Nico turned off the highway toward the docks. The old cannery stood at the end of a broken pier where the harbor turned to rust, a long, low building with its windows painted black years ago, and it was quiet, and it was watching. Mara knew this place. She had bled in this place. Corrado had made her run its length in the dark until she could do it without a sound, had made her fight in its empty rooms until fighting was as natural to her as breath, had told her here, over and over, that the Ferrante had taken everything from her, and only she could take it back. Standing outside it now, with the true story finally in her hands, she felt the whole geography of her grief turn inside out. Every hard thing he had ever taught her, he had taught her here, so that when the day came she would be sharp enough to open his door. He had built her in this building, and he had never once imagined that he was building the thing that would come back through the door to end him. They did not go in the front. Mara knew a way, of course she knew a way. He had drilled the ways in and out into her himself for a night that was supposed to belong to him, and now she used them against him. And there was a terrible symmetry to it that she would carry for the rest of her life. Inside, the cannery was a cavern of shadow and the smell of old salt and rust and standing water. High up, through the black glass, the gray day made almost no impression. Down on the floor, in a cleared space between the dead machines, a single work light burned on a stand, and in the pool of it there was a chair, and in the chair, small and rigid and awake, was Nina. Mara's whole body went toward the child before her mind could stop it, and it was Dario's hand on her arm that held her, hard, at the edge of the dark, because it was a trap, and they both knew it was a trap, and the surest way to get the girl killed was to run into the middle of it. Nina was not hurt. Mara made herself see it, made herself look with the cold, trained eyes and not the drowning ones. The child was frightened, her small face wet, her hands opening and closing on the absence of the rabbit, but she was not hurt. And that was Corrado, that was exactly Corrado. Keep the bait clean and keep it useful, because a mother who sees a mark on her child stops thinking, and a mother who stops thinking is easy to kill. "Aurelia," said a voice out of the dark, "you always did know the ways in. I taught you well." Corrado Speranza stepped into the edge of the light. He was an old man, and he did not look like a monster, and that was the worst of it. He looked like somebody's uncle, gray and mild and unremarkable, in his good coat, his hands folded in front of him, that small sad smile ready on his mouth, and he stood between the darkness and the child in the chair and looked at his niece coming out of the shadows with two killers behind her, and he did not seem surprised, and he did not seem afraid, and Mara understood that she had been afraid of the wrong thing her entire adult life. She had thought her uncle was her rope. He had been her handler. The mildness was the mask, and the sadness was the trick, and underneath them was the coldest thing in the building, and she had lived inside its reach for 3 years and called it family. "You didn't come alone," Corrado said. He clicked his tongue, mild, disappointed. "I raised you better." "You didn't raise me." Her voice came out level and low across the dark floor, and she could feel Dario behind her right shoulder and Nico spreading wide and silent to the left, into the dark, toward the two shapes she had already clocked at the edges of the light. "You aimed me. There's a difference. I'm only just learning it." "He's poisoned you." The old man's eyes moved past her to Dario, and something flickered in them, quick and greedy. "The Ferrante, in your ear. Whatever he's told you about me, child, ask yourself who has been beside you your whole life, and who you have known for 11 weeks. "I have a photograph," Mara said. The smile did not move, but something behind it did. She saw it. 11 weeks of watching a man's face for the truth under the stone had taught her, and now she used it on the man who had taught her everything else, and she saw the exact instant the photograph landed in him. "You were at the gate," she said. Her voice thinned, but it did not break, not here, she would not give him that here. "In daylight, before the fire, giving the order. You told me for 3 years you came too late. You told me you carried me out. You put my sister's baby in my arms and told me it was mercy, and it was a leash, and you." Her throat closed, and she forced it open. You stood at my father's gate and told them to light it." For a moment the old man was quiet, and the work light hummed, and somewhere water dripped in the dark. "Yes," Corrado said. He said it the way you agree that it might rain, and Mara heard Dario go still behind her, and she heard, very far away, her own heart. 40 years I carried their messages," the old man said, and there was no speech in it, no grand unspooling, only a few flat bitter words let out under pressure, the truth of a small cold man finally with no reason left to hide it. "Your father's brother, holding my hat in the doorway while he built a throne. I decided the doorway was the throne. I told him one thing. I told the Ferrante another. They did the rest." His eyes were on her, and they had gone dead flat, all the mildness burned off at last. "You were only ever the last piece, and now you've broken in my hand, so." His hand came out of his coat, and there was a gun in it, and it was not pointed at Mara. It was pointed at the child. Everything after that happened in the space between two heartbeats, and Mara would spend years putting it back together and never once get it fully in order, because there was no order in it. There was only the thing she was, finally and completely, off the leash for the first time in her life. She was already moving before the gun cleared the coat. 11 weeks of watching a man she was sent to kill hold a felt rabbit like it might break had not softened her, whatever Corrado believed. It had made her something he had never trained and could not predict, a woman who had already decided, without knowing she had decided, that she would die before she let one more person she loved be taken out of her chest. She crossed the cleared floor faster than she had ever crossed anything in that building in 3 years of being made to run it, and she hit the light stand as she went, and the pool of light swung wild across the ceiling, and in the lurching dark, Corrado's shot went where the chair had been an instant before, and it was not where the chair was now, because Dario Ferrante had come out of the shadow on the far side and taken the whole chair, child and all, backward out of the light with his own body wrapped around it. And Nico's gun was already speaking from the dark, driving the two shapes at the edges back into the machines. And then it was Mara and Corrado, in the swinging light, on the floor where he had built her. He was old, but he was not slow, and he had made her, which meant he knew every single thing she knew, and for a few seconds it was terrible, and even, two people who had learned the same lessons from the same hands trying to end each other in the dark. He got a grip on her wounded forearm and drove his thumb into the wire cut, and the pain of it whited out the room, and he pulled her in close, close as she had pulled the man with the rings, and hissed into her ear the way he had hissed lessons into it for 3 years. "You can't," he said. "I made you. You cannot kill the hand that made you, girl. It isn't in you. I made sure it wasn't in you." And Mara, blind with the pain in her arm and the years in her chest, found that he was almost right. He had made her. He had built the fighter and sharpened the grief and aimed the whole thing, and there was a part of her, deep and rotten and old, that still went soft at the sound of the only family she had left, even this, even now, even here. Then, from across the dark floor, out of the arms of the most feared man on the coast, a small voice cried out for her. "Mama. Nina." The child's voice cut through everything, through the pain and the training and the 3 years and the last rotten thread of the leash, and it did not make Mara soft. It made her clear. Corrado had it exactly backward, and he understood it half a second too late, when he felt the change go through her body like current. Love had not made her weak. Love was the one thing he had never been able to build or aim or leash, because he had none of it in him, and it was the thing that finally cut his wire. She was not fighting for her father's blood anymore. She was not fighting the story he had put in her head. She was fighting for a 2-year-old who had reached out in the dark and decided a monster was safe, and there was nothing in the world, nothing he had made and nothing he could say, that was going to keep her from that child. She stopped trying to overpower the man who had made her. She did the one thing he had never taught, because it was not a technique, it was a choice, and choices were the single thing he had spent 3 years trying to burn out of her. She let go of everything he had built, and in the space that opened when she stopped being his weapon, she became her father's daughter, and she ended it. It was quick. It was quiet. It was, in the end, the thing she had crossed a country to do, done at last to the right man, and when the swinging light steadied, she was standing over Corrado Speranza with her father's blackened crow pressed into his slack hand, exactly as she had promised the empty morning she would. and the cannery was silent except for a child crying and an old building settling, and the sound of her own breath going in and out, alive. Nico came out of the machines with his guns still up, and the two shapes down and no longer moving. He looked at the old man on the floor. He looked at the crow in the dead hand. And Nico, who had served the Ferrante for 30 years and hated the wrong people for 3 of them, let out a long breath and lowered the gun and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Mara turned. Dario was on the floor at the edge of the dark, with the chair on its side beside him and Nina in his arms, and he had done exactly what she had done under the oak 11 weeks before. He had put his own body between the child and the gun and taken her backward out of the light, and now he sat with his back against a dead machine and the little girl crushed to his chest. And she had both her small arms locked around his neck, the way she locked them around her mother's. And she was crying into the collar of the most dangerous man on the coast. And he had one enormous scarred hand cupped around the back of her head, gentle as anything in the world. Holding her the way he had held the gray rabbit, as though she might come apart, as though she were the only thing that ever could. Mara crossed the floor for the last time. She went down on her knees in front of them, and Nina turned at the sound of her and reached, and Mara took the child out of Dario's arms into her own and folded around her completely. And for a moment there was nothing else, no cannery, no bodies, no 3 years, no story, only a mother and a child breathing the same air again, the girl's wet face pressed into her neck, the small heart slamming against hers and then slowing, and slowing as the terror bled out of her. "I've got you," Mara said into the child's hair over and over. "I've got you, I've got you, I've got you." Dario sat back against the machine and watched them and did not reach for them and did not say anything and gave them the moment, because he had learned, in 11 weeks, that the way you love a thing like this is not by holding it tighter. It is by making a place where it is safe for it to let go. After a while, Nina's crying stopped. She lifted her head from her mother's neck and looked around the dark room with the total recovery of a very small child who has decided the bad thing is over, and she found Dario sitting against the machine, and she did the thing that broke the last of the stone in the whole building. She reached for him. She reached out of her mother's arms toward the man on the floor, both hands open, wanting, and made a small demanding sound, and Mara went still, and Dario went still, and the child hung there in the balance between them with her arms out to a killer. And Mara, kneeling on the floor where she had been made into a weapon, holding her sister's daughter, looking at the man she had crossed a country to kill and had ended up saving instead, understood that the whole long, terrible story had come down to this one small decision, whether to let the child reach. She let her reach. She shifted the girl in her arms and leaned in, and Dario came off the machine and met them halfway, and the little one went into the space between the two of them and got an arm around each of their necks and pulled, the way children do, with no idea in the world of the weight of what she was pulling together. And for a moment, the 3 of them were folded into one shape on the floor of the old cannery, the mother and the child and the man, and none of them said anything at all. And outside the black glass, the gray day was, very slowly, beginning to warm. They did not go home that night or the next. There was too much to be done, and most of it was the ugly, quiet work that follows when a man like Corrado is taken out of a doorway he held for 40 years. But Dario Ferrante was very good at that kind of work, and Nico was better. And by the time the harbor had turned over twice, the story was closed, and the doorway between 2 dead families belonged to no one, and stayed that way, because Dario had had enough of thrones and Mara had never wanted one. What Mara wanted, it turned out, was smaller and much harder to say. They circled it. There was no rushing it, and neither of them tried. She had spent 3 years aimed at him. He had spent 3 years frozen over a grave. The things between them did not dissolve in one morning at a cannery, the fire and her father and the blood on both their hands, and they did not pretend otherwise, and that, in the end, was the thing that let it grow. There was a night in the 2nd week when she could not sleep and came down and found him awake in the study, and neither of them made an excuse for being there, and she sat in the chair across from him and did not speak, and he did not speak, and they stayed like that until the window went gray, 2 people keeping each other company inside the same wreckage, and something in her settled that had not been settled in 3 years. There was a morning when Nina fell on the stone terrace and split her lip and screamed the house down, and it was Dario who reached her first, folding his huge frame down to the child's level, pressing his own sleeve to her small mouth, and Mara stood in the doorway and watched the most feared man on the coast murmur nonsense to a crying 2-year-old until the crying stopped, and she stopped being able to remember, standing there, the exact shape of the hatred she had carried into his house. She could look at his scarred hands now without flinching, not because the story had changed, but because she had watched those hands cup the back of a frightened child's head, and she knew, the way you know what kind of man was actually attached to them. The night it finally came was not a grand one. Grand was not what either of them was made of anymore. It was late, and the estate was quiet, and Nina had been down an hour with the gray rabbit back in her fist where it belonged, and Dario had gone out to the oak the way he still did some nights, and Mara had come out after him with 2 cups of something warm, and had found him lying flat on his back in the grass under the tree, in the exact place he had been the first night, with his eyes shut. For one cold instant her heart stopped, the way it had stopped that first night, and then she saw the slow, even rise and fall of his chest, and she understood that he was not pretending this time. He was asleep. The most dangerous man on the coast, who had not slept a whole night in 3 years, was asleep on his back in the grass under his wife's tree, in the open, with the doors of his fortress unbolted and a trained killer walking toward him across the dark lawn. And he did not so much as stir, because some part of him, some part that was better than all his stone and all his caution, had looked at the woman coming and decided she was safe. Mara stood over him a moment. Then she set the 2 cups down in the grass, and she lay down beside him under the oak, close, her shoulder against his, and looked up through the black branches at the sky, and let herself, for the first time in 3 years, simply be there, with no knife and no signal and no target, and nothing in her chest packed in ice. After a while, without opening his eyes, Dario found her hand in the dark and closed his scarred fingers around it. Small feet came across the grass. Mara turned her head. Nina stood at the edge of the tree's shadow in her nightdress and her mismatched socks, the gray rabbit hanging from one fist, having slipped the latch on her door again, and she looked at the 2 of them lying in the grass, and she did not hesitate, because she had settled the shape of her family a long time ago, and the grown-ups were only now catching up. She toddled over, unsteady, and climbed up into the space between them, the way she had climbed into it on the floor of the cannery, and she flopped down across the both of them with the whole confidence of a child who has never once in her life been dropped. And she pushed the damp end of the gray rabbit against Dario's cheek, and then she put her head down on his chest, right over the slow, steady beat of the heart he had sworn no one would ever reach again, and she closed her eyes. Dario Ferrante lay in the grass under the old oak with a killer's hand in his and a sleeping child on his chest, and for the length of that long, warm dark he did not open his eyes, and he did not reach for a knife, and the small weight over his heart rose and fell with his breathing, up and down, and did not go away.